May is a really exciting time in the vegetable garden and everything's growing so fast, it's actually pretty busy. Every space that comes up, something goes in, and there's actually a queue of things waiting to come in. My runner beans are out, they're almost a metre high now. They've been out since the beginning of the month, but because we've had very cold weather this spring, I've actually been fleecing them, covering them with cloches and so on, just to make sure they're okay. But only one got slightly frosted, so I did well. My squash, my courgette, they're all out, which is lovely, and they'll just cover acres and acres of soil very quickly. I do like growing unusual things as well, and one of the easiest perennial veg, and perennial veg are much easier obviously than annual veg because you just put them in and leave them, and one of the easiest is this sea kale. And this is an amazing crop. My mum started growing it many years ago, and she actually grew a massive amount, and she sold the fronds that you actually propagate it from, and she produced some when they opened the Channel Tunnel. They all ate for their celebratory meal, the Channel Tunnelers. They all had sea kale as a veg. This is rather past it. We were picking it when it's small, and this is just the stuff that's left. But you can see the top actually blanches them, just like rhubarb. So you get these very tender white stems, and you usually pick them when they're about 3 or 4 inches, which we have been doing for the last month or so. And it's not a strong flavoured crop, and it's not perhaps to everybody's taste. But when I take the top off now, it grows and it looks so beautiful when it has the light. It's really a stunner to look at, easy to grow and just a bit different. And I like to have a very varied range. French tarragon next to it, I love. This is meant to be tender, but I've had this clump here for about 10 years and it's got through quite hard frost. Lovely in salads with beef, béarnaise sauce. I just adore it. Now you can see that there's quite a few flowers in my vegetable garden. I'm not a total subscriber to companion planting. There's been very little research done on it, but I think to bring in more insects with more flowers is always a good thing. And so I like to encourage the insects. So generally, I just let things self-seed. And if I see a seedling that I don't like a nettle, I would pull out. But the chives, the aquiledias, little bits of thyme, lemon balm, poppies, and I've sown some phacelia in here which has lovely blue flowers and really does pull in the insects, and it's used as a green manure, so people actually dig it in. I would never dig it in because I don't like digging the soil, but it's so simple. You can just sow it pretty well any time of the year, then it comes and it will self-seed. So I should have it forever now, and I'm really pleased. It's a great new addition this year. I have planted some cosmos and I've got some perennial wallflowers and tulips, so I like to have a nice Catholic mix because they will just colonise the little bits of bare root and it just makes it look all hugger-mugger and exciting. My rhubarb is flowering. One question we always get asked on Gardener's Question Time is, why does my rhubarb flower? You can see mine's flowering in May, which is early for rhubarb to flower. And the reason it's flowering is because that is a big clump that I have left undivided for maybe 25 years. And so it's so tightly packed, it's just forcing itself up to go to flower. And I should do what I tell everyone else to do, is next winter I should get it out and I should divide the clump. But that is one big clump and it's going to be very hard work, so I haven't bothered. And because we've got so much rhubarb, I've got plenty to pick, so I don't really mind. So I'm not actually going to do what I tell people to do. The other thing that's flowering are the parsnips. They're just about to flower, and I've actually left them to flower. We grew far too many parsnips last year, and that is one thing with vegetable garden. It's quite difficult to get exactly what you need so you don't have gluts. But I actually enjoy the flower, so I've left it to flower, and then I might save 1 or 2 plants for seed, which I might try growing for next year. Meanwhile, my new parsnips, and you can see I've just got one short row there of about 8 plants, are growing nicely. So I should not overdo the parsnips for next year. So it's a busy month, the veg garden in May, and I love it because there's promise of all these wonderful crops to come. there's a big repair job going on here. This was my first greenhouse, my pride and joy, which we built on a budget for £1,000 about 24 years ago. And Dave, who helps me in the garden, made it for me. And we made it from reclaimed windows for the side walls and then just beams and glass cut for the roof. And it's against a north-facing wall, which might seem a bit strange to you, but greenhouses against south-facing walls are very hot. Anyway, I was thrilled with this greenhouse and it's given me loads of good service. It featured on the front cover of a Gardener's Question Time book. I think it was the first Gardener's Question Time book. But now it needs a bit of a refurb. So what we're doing is just putting a new roof on it with new beams and things. And I'm hoping it's going to do me another 22 years. Now, you might think it's a bit of a false economy, but I don't think I could have bought this space, and I think it's about 6 metres by 4 metres or something. I don't think I could have bought that amount of greenhouse by using a commercial firm, unless possibly it was a very basic aluminium one. And I like this working garden to look attractive. And so I think it was a very, very good solution. I have seen them made cheaper if you don't have the stone wall at the base. Obviously that was a huge amount of the cost. You can just do it with timber around the base if you want to do it cheaper, even cheaper than this. But it's not a fantastic draft-proof structure, but for what I want, it served me very well. I then went on and we made Mark II, which is similar to this, except it's not against a wall, and which we actually sunk. So we sunk that one about 800 mil below the ground. And the reason we did that is because I was working on a job where they had a stove house, which was underground except for the pitch part of the roof that went above the ground. And those stove houses were meant to be frost free even in very cold winters, because obviously you gain heat from the earth. And so we copied that, but not going down so deep. And I have to say, Mark II is brilliant. It's slightly lighter than this one. It holds the heat very well in the winter. In fact, it was consistently warmer during the winter with no heating than my bubble polytunnel. So I was most impressed. And these two greenhouses will hopefully now see me out. As it's May, it's a very good time to be thinking about the Chelsea chop, because it saves you a lot of time later on in staking. Something like sedums are wonderful now, but come June, July, they'll start to flop over and look quite gangly. And I've got this lovely new blight-resistant box hedge called Heritage growing in front, and I don't want it tipping all over that and smothering it. I want to give it its best chance. Now, the Chelsea chop is given its name because it's usually done around the time of Chelsea. Now, it's been a very cold spring, so you could carry on doing it for the next 3 weeks, I would say, at least into early mid-June. And the reason you do it is you then get smaller plants, you have later flowers, but you have more of them, although you've got less size. So that manipulates the time when they flower. So some people, if they're going away earlier on, they do the Chelsea chop because then they'll have the flowers when they come back. And some people don't chop all the stems back, they just chop half, so they have some earlier and some taller later. Now with this clump, I'm going to cut them all back. I'm going to take them back by about 1/3 to 1/2, and I could, if I wanted to, use the tops for cutting material, because sedum really do really well from cuttings. Now, you can do it with lots of plants. Sedum I always do because it is such a gangly job. It does just lean over, and when you start to stake it, it just looks a bit of a mess and it's a bit of a faff. It's much nicer to have a tighter, neater plant, I think. Now, behind it, you can see the Nepeta. And this is another one. This is the tall one, Six Hills Giant, and it can get very floppity-doppity. So again, I could go in, I could reduce those stems by 1/2 to 1/3. I'd have slightly later flowers, I'd have more flowers, but it would be more compact plant. Things like phlox, excellent with phlox, excellent with penstemons, excellent with the perennial sunflowers, Helianthus. So there's many things you can do. So really, it's a good time just to go around and look at everything that gets a bit floppity that you'd think would be good, to be flower a wee bit later and be smaller, more compact. Achilles, perfect. And have a look at all your plants and just see what can I do to them to keep them more contained, to manipulate the flowering. And it's a fun way to garden and just experiment. You know, you can have some early Achilles, some later Achilles. Just try different things. This is one of my favourite spaces in the garden. It's the tiniest, this thin sliver of ground against the south-facing wall where I have all my treasures, right by the kitchen, so I can give them all the TLC that they need. But the problem was I made a fundamental error and I let this box head just get a bit too big and it was becoming too cramped. So I'm now going to renovate it. I'm going to dramatically cut it back, as you see I've done here most of it already, and then it will spring back and I'll maintain it at the lower level. Now, I've done this with many hedges. I've done it with 100-year-old yew hedges. I've done it with old hawthorn hedges. I've done it with beech hedges. The only hedge you cannot do it with is a conifer hedge, with the exception of yew, which is a conifer, but it has berries, not cones. So anything like western red cedar, leyland cypress, don't cut those back, because as soon as you cut into the old wood, i.e. the wood where you haven't got leaves, then they won't rejuvenate. But box and all those others I mentioned do rejuvenate. Now, the best time to do this probably would have been maybe 3 or 4 weeks earlier, but it's been an exceptionally cold spring. I haven't had time, and now I've got my pots back out and I just want to go for it. I'll make sure I water it and feed it afterwards, which will just kick it into life. It might take a few years. It's not going to look as good as new this time next year, I don't think. If you see the end, that was bald when I cut the bit away from it maybe 2-3 years ago, and now it's sprouting nicely. But you will have a very nice new hedge out of it, and it is well worth doing. Right, let's go for it. I'm really pleased with this orchid that I planted maybe 3 weeks ago. Having grown it in a pot for a couple of years, I've put it out, as I failed to establish them before by planting them straight out. Now it's flowering beautifully, and I'm hoping that in a few years we'll have a whole meadow full of orchids. Aren't I optimistic? I'm just going to give it a good soak to make sure it has a really good start in life. And I'll carry on doing this once every few weeks for the next 2 or 3 months if it's this dry.